Hey guys, so over the winter holiday, I was able for the first time to go to the Universal Studios in Orlando and see the Wizarding World of Harry Potter, and it was amazing. I've been to the one in California. I actually got my wand from there. It's Ashwood and Phoenix Feather if you're interested, but the Wizarding World in Orlando was next level. I actually ended up getting this chocolate frog with a Nicholas Flamel card inside of it, and of course, I was in Weasley Wizards Wheezes, and I had to pick up a Steaming Snack Box, which I've been thinking about doing a live stream for, like where I open up the candies, or I guess I open up the box and then I eat the candies. I've tried one of them, and it was kind of a miss, but hopefully the rest of them won't be misses, so let me know if that's something you'd be interested in if I actually did it. Anyway, all of that was to say that it reminded me that I have not actually finished my Ranking Potter series yet, and so on my long drive back up from Orlando, I plugged in my headphones and listened to the Deathly Hallows the whole way home so I could bring you this review. And now it's time to talk about it. Right after the intro rolls, of course. When I was a kid and saw that I was on the final entry into the series after Half-Blood Prince, I was a bit concerned. Because this is one of my favorite book series and it was ending. And two, because I felt like there was still an overwhelming amount of ground to cover in one book. And while this book is definitely beefy, I think it's the second longest in the whole series, I do feel like my childhood concerns were a bit warranted because this book has some of the strangest pacing I've ever seen. And while I almost want to call it overly convenient in terms of the way Harry, Ron, and Hermione get from one place to another, there wasn't honestly that much random chance in this book, or at least there wasn't that much more than in any other entry into the series. Also, just quick question, does anyone else feel sad after finishing the Harry Potter series? I know when I was a kid, I was distraught after I finished this book in some parking lot of a local smoothie chain. And oddly, even as an adult, every time I finish this series, and even though I know that there's so much rereadability to this book, it still leaves me with this sense of sadness at the end. And it's not really a criticism. It's probably more praise than anything else, towards the emotional impact this book had on me. But I just want to know if I am the only one that is weird about finishing this series. Anyway, whatever. Doesn't really matter. Let's get back on track. So, Harry Potter and Deathly Hallows picks up right after Half-Blood Prince, with Harry understanding his final mission from Dumbledore to be find the Horcruxes, destroy them, kill Voldemort. And while Dumbledore was this stickler for details in his own life, in terms of giving specific directions, he wasn't really the best at that. Because, the cluelessness in regard to how Harry is to actually complete the mission is the primary source of tension for most of this book, which works to an extent, but can be a bit grating, especially about halfway through the really long camping section. Regardless, though, as with all things, it's probably best to start at the beginning before jumping all over the place. And here's what I'll say about the starting chapters of Deathly Hallows. It's probably in the top 3 of Harry Potter openings. This book benefits from having a lot of the tension already set by the previous entries, and we're sort of able to just jump right into the action, because Harry knows that his time being protected by his mother at Privet Drive is running out, and he also knows he has to get the Dursleys out of there before the Death Eaters come from them, which actually leads to a surprising amount of humor done at Vernon's expense, which is fine by me. Make fun of him all you want. What did surprise me, though, was how flat Petunia kind of felt in these chapters, considering her knowledge of the Wizarding World and her relationship towards Lily. But I feel that Rowling probably wanted most of the emphasis being on the way Dudley is different from his family, and I think she succeeded in that. Not that Dudley was giving Harry big hugs and full-on apologies for his treatment, but I think his line of, I don't think you were a waste of space was a powerful line, and I like how Harry's just you don't understand to the people that are coming to rescue him. That was basically Dudley saying that he loved me. And I like how there's this whole the next generation not repeating the same mistakes as the old motif, and how that was even granted to a character like Dudley. But when the Dursleys finally leave, the story actually picks up quickly because the Order arrives to Harry and tries to get him out of Privet Drive and eventually to the Burrow after arriving at the Tonks safe house. And honestly, this whole segment was an emotional roller coaster. I really loved the way we got a moment of seeing Harry getting to be with all of his allies, but instantly things go south because Snape had to inform Voldemort of the Order's plan to move Harry to maintain his cover, and as a result, we lose both Moody and Hedwig, who, can I just say, has a way more brutal death in the book than in the movies. Oh my god. Hedwig died in her cage, and then, from my understanding, Harry had to blow up the sidecar that her body was in to make sure the Death Eaters could not retrieve information from it, and that's just insanely brutal. I say all that to say, though, that within the first few chapters, Rowling really sets up the stakes of this war pretty well. And the ominous tone she creates even flows through like the lighter moments like Harry's birthday and the wedding, which while both nice, there was this constant feeling of like waiting for the other shoe to drop. It's also during these chapters that we see the main way that information is going to be delivered to us in the book, which is no longer direct due to the fact that Harry is now in the pilot seat rather than Dumbledore, who had all the answers, and instead through a lot of like cryptic clues from Dumbledore from beyond the grave. I'm thinking particularly of like the items in the will, for example, with the tales of Beetle the Bard playing a massive role in the series, which honestly, I gotta say, kind of brave of Rowling to try and introduce a piece of wizarding lore this late in the game with the Deathly Hallows. Like, yes, I know we've secretly been introduced to all of them, but I feel like it was a pretty risky gamble to introduce what could have been seen as a collection of MacGuffins, and she made them work surprisingly well. I also think that the departure from the familiar structure of the Harry Potter books was a risky move that I'm not sure landed quite as well as her introduction to the Hallows. But there was literally like no way around it that I can think of. Because not having the school year to move through and instead having more of a Percy Jacksonist quest structure was a real shift to the traditional feel of Harry Potter books. And I think in a way it actually served to make the book feel more clunky than previous entries. What I will say is that while sometimes the way we arrived to major plot points of the story were a bit wonky, I think that once we were in them, they all worked out really well. And along the way, there were some really strong character moments that I'm going to talk about in the characters section of this review. I just feel like it's important to say that before the conclusion of this book started, a lot of it felt episodic, almost like this week. Harry and friends are going to break into the Ministry of Magic. Then next week, they're going to go to Godric's Hollow. And in this episode, we're breaking into Gringotts. And again, none of those moments were individually bad. The suspense in all of them, frankly, were excellent and were much needed pickups from the slower moments of this book. It's just that without the school year to connect all these events in the castle, they all felt more loosely connected than anything else. And I feel like now is probably the best time to get this out of the way so I don't have to repeat it later. But the pacing of this book really was all over the place. And to emphasize, having slower pacing isn't a bad thing. The way Harry and Hermione's relationship is put on display and the sibling-like love they have for each other as the two are hurting is like really potent, and we could only get those in those slower paced moments. It just feels like there is a lack of consistency with the pacing in this book. It's like on one page, we're barreling down the plot like a mile a minute, and then the next we're at a complete stop. Again, these slow moments weren't bad. They were really great in allowing us as readers to feel the toll of the impossible mission on the trio's shoulder. I just wish that the overall transitions between these moments felt a bit cleaner. And I guess that's kind of the hard part about writing reviews and also wanting to be an author, is because every time I have a critique about something, I like to think of a way I'd solve it. But honestly, sometimes it feels like Rowling's hands were really tied with certain situations. I will say this though, because I have been a little bit mean and I want to say something nice. Sometimes J.K. Rowling will outright make me chuckle to myself with how clever she can be in her writing. And this is kind of a random addition here, but when I was listening to this book on the way home, and I was like hearing about the way she used Parselmouth with Nagini when they were at Godric's Hollow to make Harry not notice anything suspicious, and the fact that this only happened when Hermione wasn't in earshot, it was genuinely so masterful that I almost like started clapping in my car. Like, what a great use of this already introduced dynamic. And you know what? Speaking of Rowling's writing, I wanted to talk about her style and tone before I get into what I imagine will be the longest part of this video, which is really me harping on how Rowling used her characters in this book, because I have so much to say about almost every major character in this story. So let's talk about the writing first. Ever since Chamber of Secrets, Rowling has been making this like tonal transition in her books that really erupts in Goblet of Fire with the return of Voldemort. And while I feel that Order of the Phoenix was a bit of a miss in that direction, for the most part, Rowling has really become this master of balancing dark moments with ones of levity. And I think about, for example, Lupin coming to announce the birth of his son a chapter after the death of Dobby as an example of this. Like, Rowling does want us to feel her moments of sadness that she writes, but she's not writing grimdark and doesn't want us to choke in it. And I think it's this like delicate balance that she has to manage, and she does it pretty exceptionally well. I'm going to give it to her. Like, it's hard to balance, and I think she's great at it. This is on top of moments that surprisingly made me laugh, like Xenophilius demanding that Hermione prove that something doesn't exist when talking about the Deathly Hallows. Like, that was great. And on top of all of that, Rowling kept her prose neat. It's not particularly stellar or uber descriptive, but personally, I don't always need that to enjoy a story. and I actually appreciate the uncluttered nature of her writing. But now let's get into the area where this book particularly shines, and that is the evolution of its characters. And normally, I'd start this section with Harry, but there's one character I need to talk about first, and that is Professor Severus Snape. And I'm going to say it right here, I hate Snape. I mean, he's a fantastic character, but he is a bad guy, and I just wanted to get it on the record right here and now that he is not some misunderstood hero, and I need the internet to stop pretending like he is one. Like, you have to be a awful human being to get someone like Dumbledore to say out loud that you disgust him. But Snape managed to do that. That said, he's so much fun to learn about, and the reveal of his life in The Prince's Tale might honestly be the best part of this whole book. I actually think that Snape is one of the best reasons to reread the series, because once you know all about his double agent activity, his frankly disturbing love for Lily, and the promise he made to Dumbledore, it makes so many of the earlier moments in the series really pop out. And I will say that rereading the series did make Snape's death feel more painful than the first time I read it, but in the end, is he a good person? For me, that's a strong no. Let's talk about Harry next, though, because this was Harry at his most complex. Throughout the past 6 books, Harry has had various adults he could rely on for guidance and support, but in this book, he is on his own without the protection of either his mother or Dumbledore. And that does not mean that he doesn't get offered help. He gets a lot of help throughout the book, but we really get to see Harry wrestle with this responsibility in a more potent way than ever before. And one scene I completely forgot about and just floored me when I was reading it was when he talked to Lupin. Like, seeing Harry that angry about Lupin thinking about abandoning his family for him probably incited the most complex mix of emotions the story ever gave me. And the fact that Rowling wrote it in such a way that I didn't end up disliking either Harry or Remus because of it was pretty impressive. Harry's courage and determination have always been the focal points of his character, and while that is present in strides, some notable examples being him helping the Muggle-born wizards escape the Ministry and his determination to break into the unbreakable Gringotts, those were pretty textbook Harry moments, but what I enjoyed the most about this book was the genuine self-doubt he had, him constantly questioning if he made the most of his lessons with Dumbledore, and the way he gets frustrated with him. It was just extremely real. And his constant worry that one day his friends would realize he had no plan and abandon him were some of his most relatable moments that Harry's ever had in this series. And when Ron actually does it during the camping section of this book, you feel for Harry in a way I don't think you've ever felt for him before. I also think that this book was the most we've ever seen in terms of Harry's psychological resilience as a man. The way Rowling wrote Harry's experiencing the truth of himself as the final Horcrux, and the fact that, at least from what he understood, he had to die in order to ensure that everyone else could survive, still affected me even knowing the outcome of the whole story. And even his softer moments, like watching out for Ginny on the Marauders map every night to ensure she was safe, or him going to see the grave of his parents at Godric's Hollow, everything about Harry in this book feels incredibly authentic. And just quick note about Ginny, I guess that's on me for letting the movie color how I remember the relationship between Harry and Ginny, because in the books, they are a way more believable romance than the one that made it on screen. I have to give them that, because the one on screen was just rough. Alright, so Hermione is next, and honestly, what is there to say about Hermione that I haven't said in almost every one of my reviews? Let's start with this. If Harry still considers Ron to be best friend number 1, then he has some major issues, because not only is Hermione the backbone of almost every operation in their fight for survival, but she is absolutely Harry's ride or die. Like, the fact that she wiped her parents' memory to forget she ever existed for Harry's sake is a level of sacrifice that I wish was touched on in the book more, because she basically gave up everything Harry has ever wanted in order to help Harry's cause. And while I won't say that the movies were perfect, though I've always found them excellent, every time I think of Deathly Hallows Hermione, I think of that scene where Harry tells her that he's going to sacrifice himself, and Hermione says that she'll go with him into the forest. And while that doesn't happen in the book, with Harry actually going without saying goodbye to anyone and actually confiding the secret of what must be done after he's dead in Neville, I think that Hermione protecting Harry from when Harry and Ron are about to fight and deciding to stay with Harry when Ron, the person she loves, leaves, just solidifies her as the greatest witch and friend of Harry in the series. And like her having other great moments, like refusing to give up information to Bellatrix even when she's being tortured and coming up with a false story on the spot about the sword being a fake. She was just awesome in this book. And going back real quick to the topic of relationships, I am willing to acknowledge that while during my initial read of the series, and even today, I am a bit more partial to the idea of Hermione and Harry ending up together, I admit that the build-up to what eventually became the canon pairing is fine. It's a little late, it arrives a little late to the story, but it's fine. But now there's Ron. Ron. Sometimes I genuinely feel like Rowling did not like Ron in this series because this man has not had a super strong showing since Chamber of Secrets. Okay, so here's where I stand with Ron on this book. Of all the crash outs he's ever had, this one was the most excusable, but it still really leaves a poor taste in my mouth because, like, despite the Weasleys being relatively poor, Ron lived a very privileged life, and so him having a harder time on the hunt while members of his family are fighting is understandable, and when compounded by the locket, which seems to make everyone who wears it miserable unless you're Umbridge, who is such a miserable person that the locket has no effect on her, I get what led to Ron's actions. The problem is that the issue that he was dealing with was not unique to him, and because of that, it just ends up making Ron look weaker by comparison to Harry and Hermione. His return, though, both the story of the Deluminator and his rescuing of Harry from the pond to get the Sword of Gryffindor, which leads to the destruction of the locket, all of those were great moments for Ron, but his initial walkout only served to cheapen them all for me, rather than make it feel like this great heroic return. Ron did some interesting things too. I will say that Ron just outwardly supporting Hermione for the rest of the book to try to get back on her good side did lead to some great humor. I forgot the context of this example I'm thinking of, but I know that it was something like Hermione suggests a solution or an idea to solve this problem, and Ron's like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense, only for Hermione to immediately shut him down. It just felt perfectly age appropriate for a couple of 17-year-olds, and the bickering just, it didn't feel so offensive, but it did work. Overall, though, Ron's character in this book was a mixed bag with major lows and a couple of pretty good highs. And while I know that is what makes a complex character, he was just someone who I feel like Rowling has given the short end of the stick a lot to, and I wish he could have just had a really strong ending as opposed to what we got. Now, who do I want to talk about next? Neville or Draco? Let's do Draco next. So I feel I've said this for a lot of characters, but this is also Draco, far and away it's his best book. And while he doesn't get the redemption arc that people wanted, this is definitely the most growth we've seen from him, because throughout the series, Draco has mostly been this symbol of privilege and arrogance. He's a foil to Harry after all. But Deathly Hallows takes that image and gives it a crack, because we see Draco at his most vulnerable, trapped with his family under the thumb of Voldemort, and we see how Draco is completely in over his head, and it is when he is backed into a corner that we start to see whatever goodness remains in Draco start bubbling to the surface, and most importantly, though granted it's a bit annoying, he waffles a lot on this change of heart. For example, he refuses to give up Harry when Harry is captured in Malfoy Manor, and part of that must be because in that moment he decided that he does not want to live under the rule of Voldemort forever. However, he later confronts Harry in the Room of Requirement to retrieve his wand and acts as a blockade to Harry getting to his goal, which is destroying the next Horcrux. Again, obviously, we're not talking about the movies, but I did see this deleted scene of when Harry reveals he's still alive, and it is actually Draco that throws Harry his wand. And while it seemed like that doesn't exist in the book, it would have been nice, but it doesn't exist. I just personally feel that I would have liked it because, much like Dudley, Draco is this victim of his own upbringing, and seeing him break that chain would have been really great, but that's just not what we got. Instead, we got this almost subtle acknowledgement of the complexity of Draco, and it leaves him in this half-baked redemption state, which I feel could have been done better. Draco kind of ends up in a similar spot as Snape, though not quite as bad of a person as Snape. He also doesn't have a heroic end like Snape, so he's just kind of in the ethical gray zone floating forever. But I'll give Deathly Hallows this. It did successfully complete the transformation of Draco from some caricature of spoiled bratness to a person who is fully struggling with the weight of their choices, and I guess that's the best we could expect from him. Neville, on the other hand, his arc is explicit and perfect, because Neville's evolution from a kid in Gryffindor that everything bad would happen to into the absolute Chad that he is in this book is just satisfying. There's no other word for it. We learned at the end of Book 5 that Neville could have been the chosen one if Voldemort had chosen differently the night he attacked the Potters. And I have to say, Tom was kind of in a bit of a rock and a hard place, because if this book goes to show anything, Neville would have been a problem for him too if he had become the chosen one. And just getting moments where we see Neville continue Dumbledore's army in the school and become the de facto leader of the resistance to Snape and the Death Eaters, surviving torture from the Cruciatus Curse and protecting the younger students, all while utilizing everything he's learned both from Harry and his own specialties like herbology, was all just so well written. And honestly, Neville might be peak in terms of what secondary characters can be in fiction. I also love this moment where Augusta Longbottom arrives for the Battle of Hogwarts and asks Harry where Neville is, and the pride she has in him when Harry tells her that he's on the front line fighting was just chef's kiss. Like, I just remember I just felt so warm when Augusta goes like, oh, well, naturally, I'll go join him. It was just perfect. Loved it. And actually, the adults in this series did offer a lot of heartwarming opportunities in this book that I didn't really expect. Like McGonagall telling Harry that she was happy to see him and instantly doing whatever she could to help him, and seeing how that love was reciprocated between the two of them, with the very idea of the Carrows spitting on McGonagall being enough to infuriate Harry to the point that he fires the Cruciatus Curse that's actually potent, was also just awesome. Love their dynamic. Wish we saw more of it, honestly. But we get what we get. And then the moments with Hagrid, particularly him carrying back what he believes to be a dead Harry to the castle, really just made you feel the love Harry had around him. And placing that scene with Harry's visit, placing that scene right after Harry's visits from all of his loved ones from the Resurrection Stone and the Snitch, just hit on like all emotional levels. And this idea of like exploring the emotions of adults doesn't just apply to the good characters, because there was actually a surprising amount of insight given into the lives of the Malfoys under the rule of Voldemort. And I just love this whole be careful what you wish for theme that Rowling played with regarding the Malfoy family, because for so long, all they wanted was this return to the old ways of pureblood supremacy. But in having to rely on and take orders from Voldemort to do it, we start to see the toll it takes on them. Like Lucius has nervous breakdowns, and fear and embarrassment is all being put on full display. And that's, extremely satisfying because he was a pompous jerk. But we also get to see the anxiety of the whole family that is just so palpable that for a moment you start to really feel bad for them. And there's this level of like uncomfort or discomfort even for the bad guys, quote unquote, bad guys. And Narcissa's kind of in that same boat too, and while she's never gotten much shine, Rowling always has been big on this motif of like the power of a mother's love, and I'm happy she didn't limit that motif to just the mother of our protagonist, as it is the same love that Lily used to protect Harry that Narcissa uses to protect her mind from Voldemort, as she lies to his face because Harry told her that Draco was still alive and she wanted to go and save him. And you know what? Since we were talking about the Malfoys and Malfoy-adjacent characters, let's all talk about literally the most painful death in this series, unless you think that is the death of Lupin and Tonks, which is also devastating but not the most painful to me. We're talking, of course, about Dobby. And Dobby's stint in this book is really short, but even in his, I believe, 2 or 3 chapters, he leaves such a mark on this story, because since book 2, Dobby has been looking out for Harry, and seeing how willing he was to make that ultimate sacrifice for the boy who freed him was so tender and so painful. Throughout the series, house elves have been extremely underestimated by dark wizards, and Dobby is a testament to their ability to resist, as him helping Harry escape one of his tightest jams in this book, disarming wizards and getting the group to safety, just shows how impressive of a character Dobby was. But all of that pales in comparison to the impact of his death, which, brutal. And I love that Rowling didn't pull any punches. We are allowed to grieve Dobby thoroughly, and it really bleeds through. It doesn't just affect Harry, it affects the readers, and it is painful. And when Harry was digging the grave by hand, and how instead of questioning it, others came to try and help him, it was all perfect. And Dobby having the opportunity to go out doing what he wanted to do was just horribly emotional, and it was so impactful. Okay, moving off Dobby, Griphook. He sucks, I hate him, I'm glad he's dead. Okay, moving on. Let's talk about the entire Weasley family that isn't Ron next. And let's start with Arthur and Molly, who for so long have taken up this mantle as Harry's adoptive parents, and you can really feel the concern they have for their children throughout this book. This is more on Molly than Arthur, but her desperation to try to understand Harry's mission and to try to talk them out of leaving on his quest is actually really sad. I remember reading this as a kid and being like, dang woman, let Harry go on his quest. But now reading it back as like an adult, the desperation in both Arthur and Molly wanting to protect their kids just leaves you with such a bittersweet feeling because it's heartwarming, but also just so filled with desperation. And with how much the Weasleys lose in this book, the family is constantly in the back of your mind as you conceptualize the horrors of war throughout the story. Bill, kind of like Arthur, is not a character with the most chances to shine in this book, but when he's on page, I felt personally like there was a little bit more security, and him offering to help in terms of things like the Gringotts break, it was sweet if nothing else, and getting to see his relationship like panned out with Fleur was also nice, if, not filler, but nice. I do like seeing how much of what Ron believes it is to be a man, and like how much I imagine it comes from Bill. Like when Bill, Kingsley, and Remus all silently agree to go and retrieve Moody's body after they arrive at the safe house, I personally thought that was like a really cool moment for him, and it makes sense to me why so many of the siblings would look up to Bill as a role model. Okay, so correct me if I'm wrong, but Ginny does next to nothing in this book. Like, we hear about her trying to steal the sword of Gryffindor for Harry, and we hear that she was part of Dumbledore's army resisting the Carrows, but we really don't see that much of her, and truthfully, kind of a shame, because yes, we hear her dueling, we hear mention of her dueling, which is great, I'm glad she was there, but I really wish I could have gotten more from her, considering she is literally the main love interest of the story's main protagonist. Alright, lastly, the twins and Percy, because, oh my god, what a beatdown of a section this was. Like, Percy's return was frankly a beautiful thing. Him finally coming to his senses and his apology to his family felt very heartfelt, felt very sincere. But the fact that his return to Weasley form in joking around with Fred and George is punctuated by Fred's death is probably one of the biggest gut punches this series has ever gave me. And I think Rowling did this thing where we always see Fred and George as a combined unit. And when George gets his ear cut off by who we later learn was Snape actually trying to protect Harry, we kind of feel like both he and Fred are off the hooks. After all, one of them's already been hurt. But after 6 books of treating the twins like one unit and allowing us to let our guards down, Rowling reminds us that the fate of the twins are not intertwined, and Fred dies. And that whole scene with Ron and Percy not wanting to leave Fred and Ron trying to hold himself together to get Percy out of the line of fire was probably one of the strongest Weasley moments in the series, but it was just such a devastating end to a chapter, and it was a death that lingers throughout the entire rest of the book, and for me, honestly, even after the story ended. But now let's talk about one of the other most integral families to this story, and that, of course, is the Dumbledores. So much of this book revolves around the tension regarding Harry's seeming lack of information and the anger he feels towards Albus for failing to train him properly. And for so long, we've always seen Dumbledore as this infallible figure in the wizarding world, this ever-burning white light, and boy, does that dwindle away throughout this book. And Rowling did an actually really good job in playing with Dumbledore's reputation in this book by having Rita Skeeter being the one running the smear campaign against him. Because on one hand, we know she is a liar and a sensationalist, and on the other hand, we have these primary sources and handwritten documents from Dumbledore that show him in the darkest moments of his life, and this beginning of his for the greater good philosophy, and that's just on full display. And one thing I loved is how Hermione and Ron keep trying to make excuses for Dumbledore, and Harry doesn't buy any of it. He's immediately like, he was no older than we are. He was no younger than we are when he made these mistakes, and we wouldn't do the same thing. And I like how he is not someone holding Dumbledore anymore to these lofty expectations, but seeing him now as a fully realized human being. And having Dumbledore's past exposed and learning about how flawed he was as a person was devastating for me when I first read the book. But it's something I appreciate now as an adult, and I love how when Harry was a kid, he saw Dumbledore through these kid-tinted glasses. And now the moment that he becomes a man by wizarding law, he is brutally exposed to the whole story. But nothing would have prepared me for learning about Dumbledore's relationship with Grindelwald for the first time. I remember being floored by the fact that Dumbledore not only just associated, but loved one of the greatest dark wizards of all time, and how that just messes with Harry's mind was super engaging to read. I also really enjoyed the fact that at the end of Grindelwald's life, he refuses to give up information to Voldemort regarding the Elder One because he knew that would mean that Albus's grave would be defiled, and I like that Rowling had... See, Rowling messed up a little bit with this, but I like that she made the affection, between the two, or the friendship between the two, not as one-sided as one might believe. And while not nearly as interesting as Albus, Aberforth and his story was still compelling. The story of Ariana was heartbreaking and might actually be one of the more sensible reasons for a family rift that exists in fiction. And I like how he just constantly puts pressure on Harry and sounds like he's been given, like how it sounds like he's given up, but how his actions constantly contradict his words as he continues to support the DA and also arrives for the final fight against Voldemort at Hogwarts. And while I would have appreciated a little bit more closure to his character, I don't really have that many complaints in terms of where Rowling left. And for the final character I'm going to do a deep dive into, let's talk about the man who created the whole event of the story to happen, which is Lord Voldemort. And while I don't know if this was his best book, it is probably the one where he is the most interesting to read. Because throughout the series, he's been depicted as a nearly invincible figure of evil, but this book really peels back the curtains to reveal his greatest weaknesses, his fear of dying, and his incapacity to love. And I honestly think that these are some of the most compelling aspects of Voldemort's character, especially in how Rowling uses him to explore the theme of fear, both the fear of death and the fear he inspires in others, and how that continuously comes back to bite him throughout the book. Like, his thirst to kill Harry leads him to finally becoming mortal, and the fact that he learned absolutely nothing from his attempt to kill Lily and instead makes the same mistake, granting the defenders of Hogwarts the same immunity that Harry's had to him for so long, was just a perfect way to illustrate his downfall. I also think that the nature of his death and how Harry begs for him to feel a sliver of remorse just so perfectly characterizes the both of them until the end of their respective arcs. And the fact that Voldemort dies like a mortal man is such a perfect way to show his fall from his godlike stature, and Harry's victory over him feels triumphant, if not a bit convenient. So I've brought up this idea of convenience a couple times in this review already, and in my opinion, there are some genuine flaws to this story. Overall, I still love it, but there are flaws. And my biggest hangup is the Elder Wand issue. And in my opinion, Harry physically just disarming Draco just is a bit cheap for me, particularly because of how integral the wand's switching of allegiance is in the final battle. There are smaller issues, like when Hermione says she's never performed a memory charm, but then performs a couple memory charms. And the fact that Ron manages to secure the Basilisk Fang to destroy the Horcrux by speaking Parseltongue because he heard Harry say it in his sleep just felt a little bit Deus Ex Machina. But my biggest issue is the transferring of the Elder Wand. I'm able to let it go for the enjoyment of the story, but it is something that I feel is just a lackluster part and just adds to the random chance of this book. I think that in terms of thematic messaging, this book is on par with the others, with the central focus of this book being on human actions like sacrifice and the strength of love and friendship. Harry being willing to sacrifice himself is such a huge parallel to what his parents and so many others did in the fight against Voldemort before him. And the trio's friendship is really tested to the max here. And Harry proves again that he's just a better person than me because he finds it in himself to forgive Ron. It might work for some people, just it didn't work for me. But moving on. I think that the theme of death and the inevitable fate of every living being is the one that I found a bit more interesting to look through in this book. Particularly because of the opposite ways Voldemort and Harry approach the idea, with Voldemort believing himself like the two older brothers in the Deathly Hallows fairy tale, a being that can be superior to death, and Harry becoming the true master of death by accepting the inevitability of it. And it's just a really great, representation of their overall foil throughout the story. And I've been talking for a while now, and I know that editing this is going to take forever, so let's wrap up this review by creating the argument for why Deathly Hallows could be considered the best entry into the series. Firstly, it's the conclusion, and there is always something rewarding about finally getting to the end of a series, and while what comes after the epilogue and things like The Cursed Child, which no, I will not read for this channel, is hot garbage, the canon ending of the story is wrapped up nicely. I think that this book also has some of the highest levels of tension out of any of the others due to the stakes of the story, and if you enjoy reading books that give you that knot in your chest, you'll love it. You'll have to suffer through some pretty slow moments to get there, but it definitely succeeds in building tension when it is time to deliver it. The book also delivers some of the most emotional moments in the entire series, losses that hit hard, victories that make you want to cheer whenever we get them, and The Deathly Hallows is overall the darkest book in the series too, so if that is something that interests you, you'll like it. It's a bit messy, and it doesn't shy away from showing the costs of war, but it also never completely abandons the flicker of hope, the flicker of a hopeful future, which burns just bright enough to keep you from putting down the book and giving up. If you're someone who considers Deathly Hallows their favorite book, then it's probably because you really enjoyed the epic battles, the conclusion to so many character arcs, and the payoff that has been building since page 1 of The Philosopher's Stone. And while it's not my favorite of all the Harry Potter novels, it is one of my favorite last entries into a saga that I've ever read. Whew. We're finally at the end. I don't even know, I don't even want to think about how long it's going to take for me to put these clips together. But I really hope you enjoyed this really long review of Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. If you did, leaving a like really helps YouTube spread this video through their algorithm. And if you really want to support me, subscribing to the channel is a great way to do that. But with that said, I got to start booting up Final Cut Pro and preparing to write my next review. So until then, I hope you have a great rest of your day. And until next time, peace